I've got a question for Guy as well. My name's James Vanatakis. I'm from UWS, and I'm a Gen Xer as well, so I feel for you. One of the questions, I suppose, one of the points of John's paper you didn't respond to was the issue of a people's or another public bank. Do you think the financial system within Australia is, I suppose, open to that possibility? Thanks.
I've actually got some practice because someone asked me this question yesterday, so I actually had another public event I was at, so I had some practice answering this. So one thing John mentioned, which I think is actually important, is there is, credit unions and building societies, and despite what John said, there are actually a few building societies left around the place. So credit unions and building societies are sort of local-based institutions, very community-oriented, and so which by and large partake in the sort of narrow banking that John's talking about. So there is that entity out there. They're not a trivial part of the financial system by any means, actually. So that's one point I'd make. The second point I'd make is that we had a bunch of state-owned banks back in the 80s, including I saw this firsthand in my own state in South Australia, where now they didn't follow John's edict in the sense that they started heading into those investment banking territories that John doesn't want them to go into. So that's certainly the case, but they were a state-owned bank, and I think it just shows the sort of issues that can arise even with what was set up originally as something designed to fulfil the sort of role that John was looking at. And now that doesn't mean that you couldn't prevent that happening again, but it is a place we were at and which didn't necessarily work.
If I could respond to that, I mean the state-owned bank's story is really a bit of a furphy in a couple of respects. What we had was a state-regulated sector, in which, of course, the state-owned banks were part of. That sector, both public and private, ran into huge difficulties at the time of the recession. Victoria had the Pyramid Building Society, which was a very large portion of the building society sector there. Simply, in that atmosphere of financial deregulation, the state governments didn't have deep enough pockets or enough regulatory expertise to salvage the institutions they regulated. What's not nearly so well known is that big members of the Big Four, like Westpac, got into terrible trouble. They didn't do better because they were privately owned. They didn't, to a large extent, do better even because they were better regulated. They survived because their regulator had essentially infinitely deep pockets, those of the Reserve Bank. Yeah. So I really think the claim that really the failure of the state banks in 1990 tells us anything very much about publicly owned banks is mistaken. Of course, the big survivor, one of the Big Four that got into the least trouble was the publicly owned Commonwealth Bank, and so I really think there is that story. It's a nice story to tell, and it's certain, and indeed justified the Keating government in forcing the privatisation of the Commonwealth Bank through, even though it had been highly successful. Really, it's a story about, when you look at it closely, first about the inadequate regulation that allowed state banks with very limited capital bases, their regulators let them go off and become incredibly high-risk institutions because they were told by the authorities at the time that was what you should do. The shock on the face of John Bannon, for example, as he sort of looked at the $3 billion bill or whatever it was and said that I was doing what all the experts said I should do in leaving this bank to go out and make heaps of money, it sort of was pretty palpable. I suppose I think that story rather than public ownership is what was relevant here.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose my point I was trying to make is just there are incentive problems arise in both public and private ownership structures. And I take John's point that private banks got into trouble too, but I would say exactly the same point. Public banks got into trouble too. Yeah. So those incentive problems arise pretty much regardless of the ownership. No,
certainly public ownership is not necessarily a cure, and we could do a lot of, and the credit unions could perform a lot of these functions. So.
Thank you.